concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Commissioner of the Australian Federal Police today revealed at Senate estimates that the government has cut over $184 million from the AFP, with 117 officers cut this year. Is the Commissioner correct when he says these cuts will mostly apply to our discretionary funding, so that is areas that fund a large portion of our anti-narcotics, our organised crime work, our general operation work, our fraud and anti-corruption?
Hear, hear.
The Minister for Justice. The member for Isaacs will cease interjecting. Members on my left. The Minister has the call.
Very knowledgeable.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Look, and I'm not sure whether the Labor opposition is determined to wilfully mislead this House, because they've asked questions like this before, or whether they are actually clueless about how the budgetary cycle works. Now, I'm happy, and I've offered briefings to the Shadow Minister for Justice before about the budgetary cycle. She hasn't taken them up, but I'm very happy to run through how it works. Now, budgets work over a 4-year cycle. They work over a 4-year cycle.
The member
so
for
when we make
McMahon will
commitments,
cease interjecting.
we make commitments over the 4-year cycle. So if we make an announcement, for example, about extra funding to the National Anti-Gang Squad, what happens is that exists in the budget for 4 years and then it terminates at the end of those 4 years. Now, the logic that the ALP, the logic that the opposition are bringing to this argument is if I were to stand up tomorrow and say we're adding an extra $100 million worth of funding to the AFP, the Labor opposition will get up and say we're cutting the AFP's funding of $100 million in 4 years' time. That is the logic that they are bringing to this argument. Now, the facts are very clear. We have made record investments in the capacity of the Australian Federal Police. Record investments. I was very pleased prior to last year's budget to stand up with the Prime Minister and announce that on top of the record investments we've already made, we added an extra $321 million to the capability of the Australian Federal Police. This is the largest investment in the Australian Federal Police's domestic capability in a decade. This is in stark contrast to the record of the Labor Party when they were in government. They used our law enforcement community as a never-ending reservoir to make up for their inability to balance the budget. They cut funding to the Australian Federal Police. They absolutely gutted the Australian Crime Commission at the time. They completely gutted Customs, destroying the ability of Customs to screen cargo as it crossed our threshold, resulting in guns coming in at the post office at Sylvania Waters. What we have had to do since we arrived in office in 2013, the most important job I have had is to undo the damage done by the Labor Party when they were in office. The Australian Federal Police has never been better supported than they are at the moment. Never been better supported, and constantly and willfully making the same false representations in this House does not change these basic facts.
Just before I call the member for Chisholm, members on both sides will cease interjecting. The member for Moreton's been warned. The member for Ballarat will also cease interjecting, and the member for Chisholm has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how the government is reducing power bills for hard-working Australians, including in my electorate of Chisholm? Is the Prime Minister aware of any risks to the government's approach?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for a question. Mr Speaker, the largest risk to the energy affordability and reliability in Australia are the honourable members sitting opposite. They have demonstrated again and again that they are a threat to affordable energy through their reckless and incompetent prosecution of an ideological agenda in energy. Mr Speaker, we have seen that they have failed to prioritise affordability and reliability in their ideological pursuit of renewable energy, without any regard to the fact that the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time. And if we need any confirmation of that, we only have to look at the home state of the opposition spokesman on energy, the member for Port Adelaide. South Australians know very well what a Labor energy policy looks like, and Australians would see that right around the nation if the Leader of the Opposition were to become Prime Minister. Mr Speaker, Australia cannot afford a Labor government which would increase taxes.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Lyons will leave under 94A. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, we know that were Labor to implement its policy of a 45% cut in emissions by 2030, nearly double what we had committed to in Paris, a 50% renewable energy target would add nearly $200 a year to the household energy bill, as against a $110 to $115 saving from the implementation of the National Energy Guarantee. So that is the difference. $300 a year is the price, the tax that Australians would have to pay for the Labor Party's energy incompetence. Now, we compare to what we're doing. The National Energy Guarantee, recommended by the brightest minds in the business, the most experience and the most authority. You'd think Labor would embrace it. No, they've described it as science fiction and nonsense. What about gas prices? Went through the roof because of Labor's failure to recognise that if you allow exports from the East Coast without doing anything to protect the domestic market, you'll get tight supply and higher prices. They were warned, they ignored the warnings, prices went through the roof, so did electricity prices, 65,000 jobs are at risk. We moved and we have now secured the gas supplies that the East Coast market needs. No thanks to the Labor Party cleaning up their mess. We've delivered reform on limited merits reviews. No more can the owners of the poles and wires game the system
Prime Minister's
and jack
time
up prices.
has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware of any policies or decisions taken by him or his government that are diminishing the operational capacity of the Australian Federal Police?
The Prime Minister has the call.
As the Minister for Justice very eloquently and comprehensively replied, the support that we have given to the Australian Federal Police is at an unprecedented level, $321 million in the last budget, the largest single funding boost for the AFP's domestic policing capabilities in a decade. And, Mr Speaker, what we have provided the AFP with is the ability to fill new specialist positions so vital to keep Australians safe in the face of the threat of terrorism, 100 intelligence experts, over 100 tactical response and covert surveillance operators, and just under 100 new forensic specialists. And I don't know whether honourable members opposite have had the opportunity to visit the Federal Police headquarters there at Madura to see the extraordinary work that's undertaken by the tactical response team, by the forensic specialists. We are dealing with people the police there are at the absolute cutting edge of science and technology. That's what we need to keep Australians safe, and we are providing them with the financial resources to enable them to do that. But in addition, Mr Speaker, what we are also doing is providing them with the legislation, with the laws that they need to keep us safe. Again, one tranche of national security legislation after another has been passed through this parliament at the instigation of my government and indeed of the government headed by the member for Warringah. We have done that. We have done everything to make Australians safe and give our agencies, our national security agencies, our intelligence services and indeed the ADF, all of the tools they need to keep Australians safe in dangerous times.
The member for Petrie.
Well, Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer please advise the House how the National Energy Guarantee will work to boost Australia's productivity, creating more and better-paying jobs for hard-working Australians, not just in Petrie, but all around Australia? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Petrie for his question. The 5-yearly review of productivity that this government tasked the Productivity Commission to undertake contains a section which says fixing the energy mess. It calls it an appalling mess, Mr Speaker, and it was a mess created by the Labor Party. And the Productivity Commission has said that if we want more and better paid jobs, which is what productivity means, we have to fix that mess, Mr Speaker, and we are fixing that appalling mess as described by the Productivity Commission, which is standing in the way of productivity improvements, which means it's standing in the way of better wages and more and better paid jobs, which is what this government is focused on delivering. And it calls for a national answer, not an answer where the states go it alone. It calls for a national answer that is technology neutral, that is efficiently priced, that recognises the need to meet our emissions reduction targets, that clearly articulates the trade-off between reliability and costs, that provides clear direction to expert bodies. And we should be listening to those expert bodies, Mr Speaker, like the Energy Security Board, set up by COAG, independently to advise the governments, not just the Commonwealth, but all states and territories on what is the best way forward, picking up on the Finkel review. And that's what they've provided us with, Mr Speaker. And they've said at the Productivity Commission that we need to let those market regulators and participants get on with the job. Now, that is exactly what we are doing by supporting the Energy Security Board's National Energy Guarantee. The right policy settings, and the Shadow Treasurer should listen to this particularly because he said it this morning, the right settings that are good for the environment and put downward pressure on prices. That's what he said. That's what the Shadow Treasurer said is the benchmark for these policies. The National Energy Guarantee delivers on that benchmark more than any other alternative, Mr Speaker, certainly those put forward by the opposition. It delivers the investment certainty that is necessary, that has caused the Business Council of Australia to today write to all state and territory leaders, arguing that the guarantee provides the best chance to break the deadlock on climate policy that has paralysed large-scale investment in dispatchable electricity generation for several years, mate. The Shadow Treasurer is like Grandpa Simpson shouting at the clouds, Mr Speaker, shaking his fist at the clouds. There he is, angry and empty, Mr Speaker, is the Shadow Treasurer and is the members of the Labor front bench, because their policy is to put prices up by $192, not to put prices down by $115, Mr Speaker. What a bunch of muppets!
The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to his previous answer. I repeat, is the Prime Minister aware of any policies or decisions taken by him or his government that have diminished the operational capacity of the Australian Federal Police, and specifically to investigate major drug importations, including the importation of cocaine?
The Prime Minister has
Mr Speaker, the chutzpah of the Leader of the Opposition. He stands up here and asks us about national security. This is the leader of a party that outsourced our borders' sovereignty to people smugglers. This is the leader of a party that, despite all of the warnings and all of the knowledge, chose to abandon the integrity of our own borders, abandon all of that, outsourced border protection to people smugglers. And, Mr Speaker, the extraordinary performance of the Labor Party in
the Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order. Members on my right, the Manager of the Treasurer. Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yeah, it's on direct relevance, Mr Speaker. It's the second time a question of this nature has been asked. There's been no preamble in either, and it's specifically asking about decisions taken by the Prime Minister or his government.
I listened to the question very carefully. There are whilst it was a short question, there were a number of aspects it covered, and the Prime Minister is entitled to a preamble, and the Prime Minister is in order. There is no standing order that demands questions receive a yes/no answer. There's not. The Prime Minister has the call, and he's being relevant to the question.
And if 50,000 illegal arrivals and over 1,000 deaths at sea was not enough on border protection, that was Labor's track record. That's your glorious record. That's your record of failing Australians and security. And what about the ADF? How many naval ships did the Labor Party commission in 6 years? None. Nothing. Nothing at all. We have set out to build and are in the process of designing and building 54 naval vessels. That's the commitment we've made, a real commitment to keep Australians safe. Now, as far as the Australian Federal Police is concerned, I can say this to honourable members. Every decision we've taken, every policy we have set out, every measure relating to the AFP is focused on ensuring they have the capacity to keep us safe and the skills and the technology to do so in these dangerous times.
It's the independence question. The member for Denison has the call.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, a fourth Crown Casino whistleblower has now come forward and levelled further serious allegations of poker machines being illegally tampered with. Significantly, he names the Crown staff he alleges told him to modify machines and asked me to give these names to the police, which I'm doing. However, this worker fears for his safety and doesn't entirely trust the police or the regulators, and for that reason he asks you personally and the opposition leader to support a transparent inquiry. So, Prime Minister, will you establish a parliamentary inquiry so that the Australian people can learn the truth about the casino industry? And, Speaker, I seek leave to table these latest allegations.
The Leader of the House.
For the last part of
the member for Denison will resume his seat. The Leader of the House.
As to the last part of the question, Mr. Speaker, the purpose of tabling documents is not to allow slanderous or defamatory material to be covered by parliamentary privilege, and as I haven't seen the documents, I will not be granting leave on this occasion.
Leave is not granted. The member for Denison's asked his question. He can resume his seat if he wishes to receive an answer. The procedures are very clear. He sought leave. I didn't get to ask whether leave was granted, but I've got the answer. Leave is not granted. It's very clear, and the Prime Minister can now choose to address the question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, the police, the gambling regulators in Victoria and AUSTRAC are the appropriate people to investigate and examine these allegations. Those agencies have the necessary powers, extensive powers, and indeed powers far greater than a parliamentary committee. Now, the Victorian Commission for Gambling and Liquor Regulation, I'm advised, is investigating the allegations, and AUSTRAC is also examining the specific nature of the allegations of money laundering. Now, if any member or senators are aware of allegations of unlawfulness, I strongly encourage them to report those directly to our law enforcement and regulatory agencies. Our law enforcement agencies do an outstanding job in keeping us safe and enforcing and upholding the rule of law upon which our democracy depends. Now, I encourage the honourable member to—
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Denison on a point of order.
Speaker, this man's in fear of his life and lost faith in the regulator.
The member for Denison will resume his seat. And I say to the member for Denison, there are courtesies, as I pointed out the other day, extended to members of the crossbench in terms of the length of their questions. But there is no favouritism on points of order. A point of order, if you raise to seek a point of order, you need to state the point of order. It is not an opportunity to make a speech or to make a point you wish to make in your question. And if the member for Denison, or for that matter any other member, repeats that, I will have to take further action. The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, the honourable member, I believe, knows very well that the police and the gambling regulators and AUSTRAC are the appropriate agencies to whom to report these allegations and the appropriate agencies to investigate them, invested with all of the necessary powers. The idea that those investigations would be assisted by a simultaneous parliamentary inquiry almost beggars belief. And I say to the honourable member that if he is really concerned with ensuring that these allegations are investigated, that due process is applied and justice is done, then he would confine his revelations and his communications, his information on this matter, to the police and the regulators. That is his duty as a member of this parliament, as someone committed to upholding the law.
The member for Bowman.
A question, please, to the Foreign Minister. Will the Minister advise the House how the government will meet Australia's international commitment on carbon emissions, while also guaranteeing reliable and affordable energy for all hard-working Australians?
The Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bowman for his question and for his deep interest in ensuring that the Australian people are provided with affordable and reliable electricity. And that is indeed the priority of the Turnbull government, not only for Australian households but also for Australian businesses, so that they can be internationally competitive. Now, the National Energy Guarantee has been welcomed by those who are responsible for jobs of hundreds of thousands of Australians. And in particular, I refer to the comments of the CEO of Master Grocers, who said the Turnbull government has proposed a plan that promises businesses cheaper and more reliable electricity. The CEO of Australian Food and Grocery Council says the National Energy Guarantee's focus on delivering affordable and reliable power is a fundamental step forward in providing long-term policy certainty for Australia's largest manufacturing sector. JBS Australia said, JBS Australia, as Australia's largest meat and food processor and a major energy user, welcomes the announcement of the government's National Energy Guarantee that as a policy offers a solution to lower the costs of energy, deliver reliability and underpin a competitive Australian manufacturing sector. We employ 12,000 people across 5 Australian states. Then the Energy Consumer CEO welcomes the plan endorsed by the federal government, which integrates the need for reliable power and emissions reductions in the electricity sector for at least cost to consumers. And then the CEO of the Business Council of Australia said the government's plan is the most practical, workable thing we've seen in business for quite some time. It brings together the 3 crucial things: affordability, reliability and meeting our carbon target. And, Mr Speaker, that is absolutely correct. This is the first time that we've seen climate policy and energy policy integrated to give affordable and reliable power as well as meet our international obligations. Mr Speaker, compare and contrast Labor's unaffordable, unreliable, irresponsible policy. A 45% emissions reduction target is way beyond any other target by any comparable economy, whether it's Japan or New Zealand or Canada or the EU. And the 50% renewable energy target that the Labor opposition would embrace in government would drive up power prices, drive down jobs growth and put our international competitiveness at risk. Mr Speaker, the $66 billion subsidy that the Labor opposition want to impose on Australian businesses and households would be passed on to consumers, again driving up power prices, driving down jobs growth and putting our international competitiveness at risk. Mr Speaker, the choice is clear. The Labor Party stands for higher power prices. The Coalition stands for affordable and reliable energy that meets our international obligations.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is for the Prime Minister. Was the Attorney-General accurately representing the Prime Minister as his representative in Senate estimates when last night he defended the conduct of Bruce Bilson, saying, "It is very appropriate for backbench members of parliament to receive remuneration from third-party sources, not inconsistent with their responsibility as members of parliament.
Sorry,
it's both
the
consistent."
Manager of Opposition Business, if he could just... I'm wanting to listen very closely to the question. Members on both sides are interjecting and have prevented me hearing what I think might be a critical part of it. I'd just like the Manager of Opposition Business to begin his question again.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Was the Attorney-General accurately representing the Prime Minister as his representative in Senate estimates when last night he defended the conduct of Bruce Bilson, saying, "It is very appropriate for backbench members of parliament to receive remuneration from third-party sources not inconsistent with their responsibility as members of parliament. It's both consistent and commonplace." Is the behaviour of Bruce Bilson commonplace for this government? Just how many members of the government are we talking about?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The members' interest disclosure system, which all honourable members here are very familiar with, does provide for the disclosure of income over and above a member's parliamentary salary, and it's open to the honourable member or anyone else with an interest in the matter to go through all those disclosures and determine how many backbenchers are in receipt of income from third-party sources, as the honourable member described it.
The member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment and Energy, and I know the Minister is well aware of the difficulties South Australia has been having with its electricity market. Will the Minister update the House on the importance of the government's commitment to energy affordability and reliability, and what obstacles stand in the way of delivering reliable and affordable energy to hard-working Australian businesses and families?
The Minister for Energy and the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Grey for his question. I know that he is deeply focused on reducing the power prices for his constituents and major businesses, whether it's Arium, whether it's Nearstar at Port Pirie, whether it's BHP at Olympic Dam, and he particularly welcomes the Turnbull government's commitment to solar thermal projects, including at Port Augusta, as well as in the Upper Spencer Gulf, a pumped hydro facility at Kultana, Mr. Speaker. Now, on this side of the House, we support the National Energy Guarantee because we know it is going to lead to reliable, affordable power, as well as meeting our international commitments. No taxes, no subsidies and no trading schemes. And it's been broadly welcomed by the Minerals Council, by the manufacturers, by the meat processors, by the irrigators, by the grocers, by Australia's biggest employers, by the BECA, by the AIG Group, endorsed by the Chief Scientist, Mr. Speaker. But there's only one person. There's only one person who's not yet on board. Guess who, Mr. Speaker? Guess who? It's the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition is like that Japanese soldier, Hiro Onoda, Mr. Speaker. 30 years he was stuck in the jungle, Mr. Speaker, lost in the jungle, refusing to surrender while everyone was getting on. In fact, they found the Leader of the Opposition there in the jungle with his emissions intensity scheme in one hand, Mr. Speaker, and the climate wars in the other, Mr. Speaker, and the climate wars in the other. There was the Leader of the Opposition. Now today, in The Australian, on the front page, it has been revealed that modelling undertaken by the Climate Change Authority will mean that Labor's emissions intensity scheme and its 50% renewable energy target won't lead to power prices going down, but going up by nearly $200, Mr. Speaker. Nearly $200. So while the National Energy Guarantee will lead to savings of up to $115, Labor's policy will lead to an increase of nearly $200, Mr. Speaker, which is not good news for the people of his electorate in Port Adelaide or for the people of Maribyrnong or the people in the electorate of Watson, Mr. Speaker. Now, the Labor Party has a very bad policy. The member for Port Adelaide, he might be a good bloke, but he's in charge of a very bad policy, Mr Speaker. And the prices are going up under the Labor Party, if they ever got their chance back in government, as they went up when they were last in government, up by 100%. So it's time the Labor Party got on board with the National Energy Guarantee and gave us more reliable and affordable power, which is what the coalition will do.
The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. In question time today, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "Every decision, every policy, every measure relating to the AFP is focused on ensuring they have the capacity to keep us safe." How then does the Prime Minister explain an ABC report which has just appeared online which states, and I quote, "A July AFP memo revealed resourcing shortages left the AFP unable to properly investigate a 1.6-tonne cocaine importation, leaving it to be handled offshore, meaning the operation of the Australian-based crime group behind the import could not be properly explored."
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'll invite the minister to add to this answer, but let me just say this.
The Leader of the Opposition.
The runs, in terms of intercepting drug importation, we have seen record seizures, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of drugs seized, and extraordinary cooperation between the AFP, between Border Force and foreign and police and security agencies overseas. We are cracking down on those drug importers on a scale never seen before, but I should say, Mr Speaker, the challenge is on a scale never seen before, and we will need to do more and more. We understand that. But the combination of great policing, great investigation, great intelligence is a credit not simply to the AFP and the other agencies with which they worked, but also to the extra resources, intelligence, legislative, financial, that we are putting behind our effort to stamp out drug importation.
The Minister for Justice.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'll just invite the opposition to look at the scoreboard that our law enforcement agencies have actually managed over the past 4 years. Record seizures of cocaine, record seizures of crystal methamphetamine, record seizures of precursors such as ephedrine. We've never seen a better, more coordinated and joined-up effort from our law enforcement community. The Australian Federal Police, working in conjunction with the Australian Border Force, working in conjunction with the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission, and we have seen these record seizures. We've sent our law enforcement agents out into the world incredibly effectively. Task Force Blaze in China, the only joint task force of any foreign law enforcement agency with the Chinese National Narcotics Control Bureau. That one task force alone, AFP officers working side by side with their Chinese counterparts, has stopped 13 tonnes of drugs from hitting Australian streets within the past 2 years. 13 tonnes. We've now got similar task forces with the Royal Thai Police and the Royal Cambodian Police. Mr Speaker, we do have a significant problem with the high demand for illicit drugs in Australia. We've been tackling it by tackling the supply side, and our efforts have never been more effective with the law enforcement operations that I've just outlined. We've also tackled the demand side, particularly in relation to crystal methamphetamine or ice, with the largest investment in drug and alcohol rehabilitation in Australia's history. And I'm very pleased to report to the House, because this is the first time we've ever had comprehensive information, that we are seeing the embryonic start of a decrease in ice usage throughout our community. This is a direct result of the efforts of our law enforcement community, combined with what we have done to decrease demand for this insidious drug.
Concluded. The member for Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Agriculture, Water Resources and Northern Australia. Will the Deputy Prime Minister advise the House how the government's energy policy will guarantee reliable and affordable energy for hard-working farmers and businesses in regional communities, like those in my electorate of Flynn? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question and note that in his past that he has done blue-collar work. He was a fettler. He actually believes in blue-collar worker jobs. He actually believes in blue-collar worker jokes. And unfortunately, those on the other side, a lot of university graduates, no problems with that, a lot of solicitors, but no labourers in the Labor Party anymore. The member for Flintshire, no labourers in the Labor Party anymore. See, they actually believe that labourers are politically incorrect. And you can see that in their jihad that they run against some of the vital coal-fire assets in your electorate. The member for Flynn would be aware of Callide B, Callide C, Gladstone and Stanwell, all employing blue-collar workers, employing blue-collar jobs. Because the member for Flynn is not embarrassed about blue-collar workers. He has been a blue-collar worker. Unlike the Labor Party, very rarely do you ever find someone in the Labor Party who's actually done a labouring job. And then the teachers all stick up their hand. Well, I've got no problems with teachers either. Teachers are good people. And the member for Melbourne Port
Energy and the Environment.
I mean, where are these people who actually ever worked for a living in the Labor Party? Where are the labourers in the Labor Party? Where are the labourers in the Labor Party? They don't exist anymore. But we are going to make sure that we keep the jobs of Flynn, the people of Flynn, in the industrial city of Gladstone. We're going to look after the people of Gladstone rather than just look after the people of Annandale. We're going to make sure that the basket weavers do not reign supreme in our power policy of this nation. And we look for the member for Maribyrnong, who apparently used to represent Labor, he's never did any himself, but he used to represent them to come to the dispatch box and tell us about his grand vision for Australia. 50% renewables. 50% renewables. There won't be a job left in this place. They say today in the paper 75% of coal-fired power stations will have to be closed down. So what does the member for Hunter have to say about that? What does the member for Shortland have to say about that? What does the member for Herbert have to say about that? Well, they say nothing. They say nothing because they don't stand up for workers anymore. They don't stand up for workers anymore. And then we hear the piece de resistance. Of course, we're all waiting for Mr Rudd's book to come out. We're all waiting for Mr Rudd's book to come out because amongst that we hear that the member for Lilly, the former treasurer of the Millennia, was put there as a poison pill. He was there to blow up Rudd. He ended up blowing up a whole budget. He ended up blowing the budget of the nation. He was there as a joke. But they never saw the funny side of it. They kept him there. They made him the treasurer of Australia. What an enlightenment the Labor Party is. What a wonderful grace to our economic future the Labor Party is. And you know what? The joke is still here. I think the joke is making a comeback.
Members on both sides, the Leader of the Opposition has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, we support the AFP efforts, but why are the AFP advising that they lack the resources to properly investigate serious crime, including drug importation? And I quote the ABC Online, where they say, the AFP document said New South Wales AFP did not have sufficient resources to meet the operational load.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. If the honourable member spent more time listening to the AFP and less time coordinating his question time tactics with the ABC, he'd have a better insight into national security.
Members on my left, the member for Latrobe has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the minister outline to the House why reliable and affordable energy is crucial for hospitals like Casey Hospital in my electorate of Latrobe and throughout regional Victoria? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches that will drive up power prices and destabilise the energy market?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Latrobe. He's not just a great member for Latrobe and a passionate member for Latrobe, but before coming to this place, he was also a member of the Victoria Police. He was a policeman's policeman. He played senior roles in dealing with both counter-terrorism and organised crime, and in fact, he was one of the people who kicked in the door and then personally arrested Alphonse Gangitano. So we're not going to be taking any lessons from the people on that side about matters in relation to crime today. But one thing that he does know is he has a nose for the truth. And as part of that, he said to me there are two things that he knows that matter today. One, Labor loves higher electricity prices. And how does he know that? He knows that because Labor voted for a $15 billion electricity tax and he voted against it. How else does he know it? Because he voted to abolish a $15 billion electricity tax, and every member who was on that side at that time voted to keep it, not just once but on multiple occasions.
For Lindsay.
And he also knows that Labor now wants to introduce not a $15 billion electricity tax but a $66 billion electricity tax, which would have a net impact on our families of $300 a year. But he also knows that it would hurt our hospitals, that their electricity tax would be bad for our hospitals, that it would impact their ability to provide for essential services, it would impact their ability to provide for community support, all of the things that you would hope. And we know this because it's already happening in Victoria. We saw that Victoria's action in deliberately closing down the Hazelwood Power Station led to a $44 million hit on Victoria's hospitals. The Casey Hospital suffered as a consequence of the Victorian government's actions, Victorian Labor's actions, supported by every member on that side. We know that the Portland Hospital suffered an over $270,000 hit in the member for Wannan's electorate. Echuca Hospital, we've seen the Castlemaine Hospital and so many others suffer as a consequence. And that's why, on this side, we are opposed to Labor's massive new electricity tax, and the Prime Minister and the Energy Minister are taking steps to deliver reliable and affordable energy with the National Electricity Guarantee. It builds on what we've done with abolishing their electricity tax. It builds on what we've done with abolishing the limited merit review. It builds on what the Prime Minister personally did in fronting the gas companies and forcing them to change the way they were treating Australian consumers. So at the end of the day, the member for Latrobe is dead right when he says that Labor loves electricity taxes.
The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Given that the Prime Minister just advised the parliament to listen to the AFP, does the Prime Minister consider the AFP is wrong when it says that resourcing shortages left the AFP unable to properly investigate a 1.6-tonne cocaine importation? And when will the Prime Minister finally stop blaming everybody else and take some responsibility for the decisions that his government makes when it comes to the AFP?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party's commitment to the rule of law would be taken somewhat more seriously if they weren't wholly owned and beholden to the CFMEU. Let's have a look. Let's have a look. Very important.
The
when
member
you
for
look at
Bruce.
the corporate structures to see who the shareholders are.
Show us the money.
That's where the money comes from. The CFMEU. As at 8 days ago,
The member for
16th
Griffith.
of October, there were 84 CFMEU representatives before the courts, facing a total of 896
The member for
alleged
Griffith
breaches
is
of the law.
warned.
The CFMEU or its representatives were respondents in 41 separate matters before the courts, facing a total of 1,779 suspected contraventions, and over $10 million in penalties has been awarded against the AWU by the ABCC and its predecessors. Mr Speaker, the fact of the matter is Labor continues to defend an organisation that breaches the law as a matter of course, that treats fines as parking tickets. They know that if the Leader of the Opposition had the courage or the character of Bob Hawke, he would do what Bob Hawke has said. He said, "You know what I did with the
Prime
Builders'
Minister
Labourers
will resume his
Federation?"
seat. The member for Isaacs will resume his seat. Member for Isaacs will resume his seat. Been listening carefully to the Prime Minister, and I've said many times he's entitled to a preamble, and he is on the policy topic. But the question was about the AFP. I've allowed a very long preamble. In fact, we're halfway through the allotted 3 minutes, a little more. So I just ask the Prime Minister to, in the remainder of his answer, bring himself to the question that was asked.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, as I said earlier and as the Minister has said, we have given record funding in the last budget to the AFP. We provide them with the resources they need to keep us safe. And speaking for myself and, of course, for the Minister and the Attorney-General and other ministers, we are in the closest contact with the AFP. I value the advice of the AFP Commissioner, Andrew Colvin. I spend a lot of time with him. I take his advice very carefully. And he knows that when he needs the support of my government to keep Australians safe, he can always count on that support.
The member for Groom.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Employment. Will the Minister outline to the House why it is important for employer and employee organisations to act in a way that upholds the values of truthfulness and integrity, as well as managing the potential for conflict of interest? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The member for Griffith, I've asked a number of times to cease interjecting. She can now leave under 94A, and I call the Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister
Thank you very
for
much,
Employment.
Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Groom for his question. Mr Speaker, it's beyond doubt that the CFMEU is the most lawless union in Australia's history. Let's take a quick snapshot of their most recent best performances, Mr Speaker. They've become the most penalised union in Australia's industrial history, with over $10 million worth of fines. They have the record single largest fine in Australian industrial history, $2.4 million for the Barangaroo site in Sydney, awarded only a couple of months ago. The Victorian CFMEU boss, John Setka, has been publicly threatening the officers of the Fair Work Commission, who've just been going about their job, doing their work, saying that the CFMEU will make their kids ashamed of their parents. Even worse, just recently, Mr Speaker, at Oakey in Queensland, at the Glencore site, represented by the member for Capricornia, CFMEU protesters, picketers, were threatening workers going to their work at Glencore that they would rape their children if they continued to do so, Mr Speaker. That's the kind of union we're talking about with the CFMEU, Mr Speaker. So I was absolutely delighted today to read that Kevin Rudd has joined the chorus of sensible Labor leaders calling on the Leader of the Opposition to remove the CFMEU from the Labor Party in Australia, Mr Speaker. Bob Hawke did it to the BLF. He had the strength of character to stand up to a rogue union. Kevin Rudd did it to Dean Mile and Joe McDonald when he was the leader of the Labor Party. But this leader doesn't, Mr Speaker. And if you don't have the strength to stand up to the CFMEU, you don't have the strength to stand up for our nation's interests at home or abroad, Mr Speaker. But I was very surprised, Mr Speaker, when Kevin Rudd made these comments about standing up to the CFMEU, that the person who was sent out to run interference on Kevin Rudd was our old friend, the member for Sydney, Mr Speaker. The member for Sydney was asked about the CFMEU today. She defended the CFMEU. She said this, Mr Speaker. She said unions get to have a say, business gets to have a say, non-governmental organisations get to have a say. So the CFMEU is no worse than any other organisation engaging in lobbying, Mr Speaker, no worse than the AIG, no worse than our friends of the Country Women's Association, or UNICEF, Mr Speaker. These non-government organisations, CFMEU, the Country Women's Association, these lovely ladies at the Royal Show who provide a cup of tea to weary travellers and a cake, Mr Speaker, at the Royal Show, they're apparently just the same as the CFMEU. Perhaps the member for Sydney will suggest the next time John Secker's in dispute, he has a bake-off to try and resolve.
The member for Hotham.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Today, the Justice Minister said the government has, quote, never been more effective in the fight against drugs. But earlier in estimates, AFP Commissioner Colvin said the AFP is having to look at its anti-narcotics work, our organised crime work, to make up the government's $184 million cut to the Australian Federal Police. Prime Minister, who is right, you or the Australian Federal Police Commissioner?
The Minister for Justice. The Minister for Justice will pause. The member for Braddon and the member for McEwen will cease interjecting. And I think the member for Cowan was in there yet again. The Minister for Justice has the call.
Well, don't verbal a respected public servant. Don't walk into this place and try and make out that he said something that he didn't. It is absolute nonsense to say that we have cut the Australian Federal Police's budget by $184 million. It's complete nonsense. And as I said at the start of question time, either you don't understand it or you're willfully misleading.
Minister for Justice will pause for a second. The member for Hotham will cease interjecting. She's not in her seat. She's asked her question. She'll cease interjecting. The minister has the call.
Now, I'm very happy to run through the record and compare and contrast our record in government with your record when you're in government for 6 years, which saw our law enforcement not given the support and the resources that, quite frankly, they deserve. Now, we've invested since 2013 $1.5 billion in our national security and counter-terrorism operations, $128 million to fund the Serious Financial Crime Task Force. Very difficult crimes to investigate, and we've got specialist capability in there with this investment to do it. $116 million in the National Anti-Gang Squad, $25 million to expand the AFP's National Forensics Rapid Lab capability, $21 million to extend the Trade Union Royal Commission Task Force, something, of course, that we know that those opposite don't support, $15 million for the Fraud and Anti-Corruption Centre. Now, on top of these resources that we've given to our agencies, what is also very important is that we've given them the powers to do their job. Now, if the Australian Labor Party is so worried about fighting crime, why don't they join us in helping to lock up pedophiles? Why don't they support what we want to do to lock up pedophiles? Why don't they support us in wanting to lock up gun runners? And why is it that they continue to support the criminal organisations of the CFMEU? I'm just stating the facts, Mr Speaker. It's plainly the facts.
The minister will resume his seat. The manager of opposition business on a point of order. I'm going to hear the point of order without interruption.
Disgraceful. Thanks, Speaker.
Manager of opposition.
I'm referring
on a point of order.
On a point of order, I'm referring to pages 516 and 517 of practice in asking for a comment to be withdrawn.
No, the Leader of the House will cease interjecting. I'm going to hear from the manager of opposition business, and then I'll hear from the Leader of the House. I don't need to hear from him during the manager of opposition business's point of order.
Practice at 516 and 517 specifically refers to 2 points. One, that a comment does not need to be levelled against an individual member. It can be levelled generally to be offensive. And secondly, if a language of a nature likely to create disorder is included, as well as words that are generally considered unparliamentary. Specifically, criminal offences such as sedition, treason, support for corruption, deliberate dishonesty are referred to as being unparliamentary terms. Anything that associates members of parliament with in some way being approving of pedophiles is something
Members on my right. Members on my right, cease interjecting.
In terms of directly saying they don't want them to be locked up, is an extraordinary claim. I would draw members' attention to quotes from Senate estimates today that were not used by the opposition, that this sort of language is going to have an impact on the chamber, and both sides of politics should be above it.
Hear, hear. The Leader of the House on the point of order.
Mr Speaker, I understand the manager opposition business is clearly worked up about this matter, but can I just point out that
Leader of the House will pause for a second. I think I've made it clear to the House I'm considering the matter. I've heard from the manager of opposition business, largely in silence, but I've admonished those on my right during his interaction. I think those sitting behind the manager of opposition business might just reflect on whether they want me to consider this matter without being interrupted continually. The Leader of the House has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. What the Minister for Justice in his statement was referring to, which is well understood by the entire chamber, is that the government has legislation before the House to introduce minimum mandatory sentences for people who've been convicted of sentences to do with pedophilia and, in fact, gun smuggling, and the Labor Party has indicated they will not support that. It is therefore a statement of fact. It is not an insult. It is
Members on my left.
It is not an insult to the opposition, and it wouldn't have been meant as an insult to the opposition. It is a juxtaposing of this government's record on tough sentences in things like drug smuggling.
Leader of the House will now
versus the
resume his
opposition.
seat. I'm going to rule on this in a second. The member for Isaacs is warned. How, as the Deputy Manager of Opposition Business, he thought that that would be helpful when I'm trying to hear the Leader of the House is beyond me. Absolutely beyond me. And if he wasn't in the position he's in, he'd be out of the chamber. I've listened very carefully to the Leader of the Opposition. I listened carefully the other day to the Minister for Justice, and what the Leader of the House says, and I ask the forbearance of all members of the House while I complete my remarks, what the Leader of the House says is quite right, but that is not what the Minister for Justice said. He didn't refer to any legislation. He did make a very specific statement. Now, on the Manager of Opposition Business's point of order, I'm very familiar with the practice and I'm very familiar with the pages. I spent a lot of time reading practice. And he's right when he says that offensive remarks directed at individuals have been asked to be withdrawn regularly, and there have been occasions where speakers, as far back as Speaker Snedden, I think we'll find, have said remarks to a group have been asked to be withdrawn as well. Can I say, on the history of all that, it does cut both ways. You could pick what you wanted to out of all of those precedents. But I've reflected on what the minister said. He didn't say what the Leader of the House said. In fact, if he'd framed it that way, whilst I wouldn't have approved, as I said the other day, that would have been a different matter. But in terms of what I heard, I'm going to ask the minister to withdraw that and continue on with his answer.
Well, I withdraw. I'm sorry that the facts are such a deep inconvenience.
The Minister for Justice will resume his seat. Minister for Justice will resume his seat. The member for Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Will the minister update the House on the government's actions to protect the Australian community from dangerous visa holders? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable member for Moore for his question. I thank him for all the work that he does in keeping his community safe.
The Minister will just pause for a second. The member for Whitlam and the Minister for Justice will cease interjecting, as will the Minister for Urban Infrastructure, or the three of them will be out. The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection has the
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As I've reported to the House before, a key priority of the Turnbull government is to keep Australians safe. We are doing that by securing our borders, which is what the Australian public want, and we are making sure that we cancel the visas of criminals who are here on a temporary basis. The holder of a visa where they commit a crime against an Australian citizen, we cancel that visa, and we've done it now on 3,000 occasions, which is up some 1,200%. And I'm pleased to report to the House, Mr. Speaker, that we've cancelled the visas now of 154 outlaw motorcycle gang members. Now, the reason, Mr. Speaker, that this is important is that the outlaw motorcycle gang members
are the biggest importers and distributors of amphetamine and ice in this country. Now, this government has cancelled the visas of 154 bikies. The Labor Party, 6 years in government, there is no evidence that they cancelled the visa of a single bikie. Indeed, Mr Speaker, it looks like they issued visas to bikies. Now, it's important to understand also, Mr Speaker, that the bikies have infiltrated the CFMEU. The bikies in this country are involved in not legitimate trade or business or employment. They are involved in not only the distribution of drugs, but they are involved in extortion, and they are involved in hired muscle onto building sites to work for the CFMEU. Now, we've seen, Mr Speaker, some activity in Queensland where a particularly militant aspect of the CFMEU, as described by the Leader of the House in his earlier answer, some of the conduct of these individuals up at Oakey North has been absolutely disgraceful. Legendary, I hear somebody say from opposite. That is an absolute outrage, because I'll point, Mr Speaker, to one individual, Mr Brodsky, who is running at the moment for the position of National General Secretary of the CFMEU. I understand he's personally known to the Leader of the Opposition. He is a person of deplorable character. He's involved and mixed up in outlaw motorcycle gang members with contacts from the CFMEU into outlaw motorcycle gang, very well known, Mr Speaker, to law enforcement agencies in this country. And he's not been chastised by the Leader of the Opposition for his conduct up at Oakey North. He's been visited by the Leader of the Opposition, patted on the shoulder by the Leader of the Opposition, and given this rails run, it seems, to become the National Secretary of the CFMEU, with all of the links into outlaw motorcycle gangs and organised criminal activity in this country. Now, the Australian public, it is no wonder that they have a question mark over the character of this Leader of the Opposition, just like former Prime Minister Rudd does. I can say one thing to the Australian people: they cannot trust this bloke.
Concluded. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My questions to the Prime Minister refer to his previous answers. How can the Prime Minister claim today that he's cracking down on drug importers on a scale never seen before, when an AFP leak says that thanks to his $184 million cuts to the AFP, the federal police was unable to properly investigate the importation of 1.6 tonnes of cocaine and an additional 600-kilogram cocaine importation from Mexico?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, as the Minister has said, as I have said, the track record of the AFP in intercepting drug importation speaks for itself. The way in which the Labor Party
now warned
wants to challenge the competence, the efficiency of the AFP is disgraceful. The Labor Party have no basis for the claims they are making. We know that we have provided the Australian Federal Police with record levels of funding. We know that they are intercepting drugs on a scale unprecedented. But of course, as I note, Mr Speaker, the challenge, the threat is also unprecedented. And when we ask the Labor Party for some real support in this place on law enforcement, where do they stand?
Just say no.
Where does Labor stand? Where does Labor stand on punishing people who commit sexual offences against children? We've asked for mandatory sentences. You know why? Because we want to make sure they go to jail. That's why. We want to make sure they go to jail. Where is Labor? Labor won't support that. Labor won't support that. And perhaps they could explain why they don't want to support, why they won't support mandatory sentences for some of the most disgusting crimes in the criminal calendar. And Mr Speaker, what about guns? What about gun trafficking? What about gun runners, gun smugglers? We want there to be mandatory sentences for them too, because we want to make sure they go to jail. We want to make sure there is the strongest deterrent message and that they are punished. Where's Labor on that? Nowhere to be seen. Why won't Labor support us in putting pedophiles and gun runners behind bars?
The member for Fisher. The member for Fairfax.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Justice and Minister assisting the Prime Minister for counter-terrorism. Will the Minister update the House on measures the government is taking to protect our community from our worst criminals? And are there any threats to these reforms?
The Minister for Justice has the call. The member for Kingston is now warned. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Fairfax for that question. And he knows that the best way to attack criminality, the best way to stop people reoffending, is to actually give them prison sentences, is to actually have them spend time in prison. Now, Mr Speaker, we have legislation that has passed this House and will be dealt with any other place that is the strongest crackdown on Commonwealth child sex offending ever. And the reason we're doing that is because we believe these horrendous criminals should actually spend time in prison. Now, let me tell you what is the current situation. This is the current situation. This is the status quo that the Labor Party supports. 42% of Commonwealth child sex offenders do not spend 1 day in prison. Not 1 day. And of the 58%,
the Minister will just pause for a second. The Minister will resume his seat. Member will resume his seat. I have a very low tolerance for repeated interjectors, and I'm not going to keep repeating myself. The member for Moreton will now leave under 94A. He was warned earlier, and he's continued to interject. The Minister has the call.
Well, I want to repeat that, Mr Speaker, because this is the status quo that the Labor Party supports. 42% of pedophiles not spending 1 day in prison, not 1 day. 58% of those actually do go to prison. The most common length of time served is 6 months. This is the status quo.
The Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business. The Minister will cease interjecting. The member for Hotham. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Speaker, on a point of order, I ask the Minister to withdraw the statement that there are members of the House who want to see pedophiles on the street.
The Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. The member for Deakin is warned. The Manager of Opposition Business, I'm interested in his point of order. I'd like him to explain to me what his point of order is.
Speaker, I'm asking that the Minister's statement that there are members on this side of the House who want to see pedophiles on the street be withdrawn.
The Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. I certainly did not hear the Minister say no. No, I'm actually going to address the point of order. The Manager of Opposition Business can sit down for a second. I gave a very comprehensive ruling and detained the House for a long period of time, and I referred to what the Minister said last time in reference to the Leader of the House's point of order, and pointed out that if the Minister had said what the Leader of the House had said, the way he'd constructed it, and let me be very detailed about it, around the piece of legislation before the House, that would be factually based, and indeed the Prime Minister did that in just the last answer. I realise it's difficult territory. I am listening very carefully, but the Minister's answer this time is very different to his answer last time, and it's no different from the Prime Minister's answer, and it's in accordance with my ruling. He's talking about, so far he's given some statistics, and he's talking about legislation before the House. The Minister has the call. No, all right. The Manager of Opposition Business. Yes, the Manager of Opposition Business.
Speaker, we did not take a point of order during the Prime Minister's answer. While there was a view about it, it was completely in accordance with your ruling. What the Minister has said now is that those opposite support the status quo, and then he has said the status quo involves pedophiles being on the street. That's what he said.
The Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. I know that's difficult, but he's talking about the current law. So I've got to balance here what is a very robust debate with, frankly, freedom of speech with respect to legislation. And I've made a very tough ruling on the minister, and when he defied that ruling, I sat him down. I'm listening to the minister, and I'm going to keep listening to the minister. The minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And because of the howls of outrage and the objections we've got from the Manager of Opposition Business and the Leader of the Opposition,
the minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business.
I move that he be no longer heard.
The Manager of Opposition Business has moved the minister be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. I think the noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells. Lock the doors. The question is the Minister for Justice be no further heard. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Lawler and MacArthur. Tellers for the ayes, and the honourable members for Murray and Gray. Tellers for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 64, noes 73. The question is therefore negatived. Members can just take their seats. The Minister in continuation.
Well, Mr Speaker, there's two ways that the Labor opposition can get me to stop talking about this. Firstly, They can pull a stunt like they just did where they tried to close me down in question time.
Shocking.
What would be preferable is if they look at their position, realise that the status quo is not acceptable and support the reforms that we are making to make sure that child sex offenders spend time in prison.
The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
I thank the Prime Minister.